Welcome back, you relentless survivors. You didn't just stumble through the fire and come out breathing. You walked into it with your eyes open, knowing full well that something in you had to go. And from the outside, it looked like madness. It looked like self-destruction. It looked like you were throwing away everything people spend their entire lives trying to protect. They watched you let go of comfort like it was disposable. Watched you release relationships you'd outgrown, even when those relationships were the only proof they had that you were doing okay. They saw you step away from approval, from stability, from identities that once kept you safe, and they whispered the same thing to each other with that mix of pity and relief. They said you were losing it. They said you were spiraling. They said this was what happens when someone can't handle pressure. What they never understood was that you weren't collapsing. You were stripping yourself down to the bone on purpose. You were removing everything that could be used to steer you, scare you, or keep you compliant. You weren't reckless, you were precise. See, people who never question their lives think loss only happens by accident. They don't understand voluntary loss. They don't understand the kind of person who looks at a life that technically works and still says, "This isn't true enough. This isn't aligned. This isn't worth the cost of staying asleep." So when you walked away from what they envied, they needed it to mean you'd fail. Because if you could let go of what they're clinging to and still stand tall, then their fear would be exposed. Their compromises would look exactly like what they are. Fear dressed up as wisdom. They waited for the regret to show on your face. They expected the moment where you'd reach back, apologize, ask for your old place again. They were certain you'd miss the comfort, the familiarity, the validation. They were certain you'd mourn loudly, publicly, the way people are supposed to when they've made a mistake. But you didn't. You kept moving forward with a strange calm that unsettled them, a quiet resolve that didn't beg to be understood. You carried yourself like someone who knew the price and paid it willingly, like someone who had already accepted the consequences and found them lighter than the weight of staying false. That's when the narrative started to crack, because sacrifice is supposed to break people. That's the rule everyone agrees on, so they don't have to test it themselves. Sacrifice is supposed to leave you empty, bitter, diminished, but with you, something else happened. Every loss made you clearer. Every letting go made you steadier. Every door that closed removed another echo of who you used to be for other people. You weren't losing randomly, you were shedding dependencies. You were removing leverage points. You were dismantling the version of yourself that needed permission, reassurance, or applause to keep going. From the outside, it looked like collapse. On the inside, it felt like alignment. You stopped protecting a life that was built to be acceptable. You stopped maintaining an image that required constant self-betrayal. You stopped carrying roles that drained you just so others could feel comfortable around you. And yes, it hurt. But it was a clean pain, an honest one. The kind of discomfort that sharpens instead of dulls. The kind that teaches you what you can live without, and more importantly, what you can't. They don't talk enough about that part, about how loss, when chosen consciously, doesn't hollow you out. It reorganizes you. It shows you how little you actually need to stand upright in the world. How much of what you were carrying was never yours to begin with. You learn that fear shrinks when there's less to protect, that when you no longer cling to status, approval, or borrowed identities, threats lose their power. You learned that freedom doesn't come from adding more layers, but from removing the ones that don't belong. And that's when they started getting uncomfortable, because while they were still protecting every attachment, every label, every fragile structure they'd built their sense of worth on, you were becoming harder to reach, harder to intimidate, harder to manipulate. They noticed you weren't rushing anymore. You weren't scrambling to replace what you lost. You weren't trying to prove that the sacrifice was worth it. By their standards, you moved like someone who understood that alignment doesn't need witnesses. They couldn't read you the way they used to. You no longer reacted on cue. You no longer negotiated your boundaries. You no longer explained yourself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. And that silence, that absence of justification, that did more to unsettle them than any argument ever could. Because people who rely on control need reactions. They need you to defend, to doubt, to seek reassurance. When you stopped doing that, their influence dissolved quietly, without confrontation. You became lighter, not because you had less, but because you were no longer dragging dead weight behind you. Old expectations, old roles, old versions of yourself that survived on approval instead of truth. They thought losing relationships would isolate you. Instead, you discovered solitude, the kind that isn't lonely, but spacious, the kind where your thoughts finally have room to breathe without interruption or judgment. They thought losing stability would make you desperate. Instead, you discovered resourcefulness. You learned how capable you actually are when there's no safety net to perform for. They thought losing status would humble you. Instead, it clarified you. You realized how little titles and recognition had to do with presence, and how much energy you'd wasted maintaining optics instead of substance. Every sacrifice took something away, yes, but it also gave you something back they didn't expect: trust. You began to rely on your own judgment instead of consensus, your own standards instead of borrowed ones, your own sense of timing instead of external pressure. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse. That's the part they don't understand. They think sacrifice is a phase, a dramatic chapter you eventually close so you can return to normal. But you didn't return. You crossed a line, because once you've lived without the things you were told you needed, you can't be controlled by the threat of losing them again. Once you've seen how much of your life was built around fear of discomfort, you stop mistaking comfort for safety. They started watching you differently then, not with pity anymore, but with something closer to quiet recalculation. They noticed you weren't chasing outcomes the way you used to. You were choosing actions that felt aligned, even if they didn't make sense on paper. You weren't trying to win their game. You were redefining what winning even meant. Your presence changed. You spoke less, but with more weight. You listened more, but tolerated less. You moved with intention instead of urgency. And somewhere along the way, they realized something that unsettled them deeply. You didn't sacrifice everything to become impressive. You sacrificed everything to become free. Free from needing to be liked, free from needing to be understood, free from needing to belong to systems that required you to dilute yourself to survive. That kind of freedom doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It doesn't seek validation. It just exists, and it changes the temperature of every room it enters. They can feel the separation now, even if they can't name it. The subtle distance between someone who chose truth over comfort and those who chose comfort over growth. The gap between someone who has already faced loss and those still organizing their lives around avoiding it. You didn't become better than them. You became incompatible with shallow conversations, incompatible with conditional support, incompatible with environments that reward conformity over clarity. And this is where the story doesn't resolve neatly. Because you're not done shedding, you're not done becoming. The standard you've set for yourself is internal now, and it doesn't negotiate with nostalgia. You've crossed into a version of yourself that can't go back to the old world without betraying everything you paid to learn. And you know it. You feel it in the way you hesitate before re-entering familiar spaces, in the way old dynamics feel too tight, too loud, too small. This isn't the end of the transformation. It's the point of no return. And what comes next won't look like triumph to people who measure success by safety and accumulation. It will look quiet. It will look selective. It will look like distance. But you know better. You know that what you lost made room for something irreversible. And whatever you're becoming next, it won't fit where you used to belong. You didn't just change. You crossed a threshold. And once that line is crossed, there's no language for going back. After the sacrifices, after the stripping down, after the quiet rebuilding that nobody applauded, something settled inside you. Not confidence, not arrogance, something colder, something steadier. Certainty, not the loud kind that needs agreement. The internal kind that doesn't flinch when misunderstood. You stopped asking yourself if you were doing the right thing and started asking a different question altogether. Does this align with who I am now? That shift changed everything. You noticed it first in small moments. In how arguments no longer hooked you. In how manipulation felt obvious instead of confusing. In how pressure lost its urgency because you'd already survived worse without breaking. People expected you to come back softer, more agreeable, grateful for second chances. They thought sacrifice would humble you into compliance. Instead, it clarified you into refusal. You no longer negotiate with environments that require self-erasure. You no longer chase rooms that don't have space for your full presence. You no longer explain your standards to people who benefit from you lowering them. And that's when the distance became visible. Not dramatic, not hostile, just undeniable. Some people couldn't follow you because the path required letting go of comfort they still worship. Others didn't want to follow you because your choices forced them to question their own. And a few simply couldn't recognize you anymore because the version of you they understood no longer exists. You felt the separation deepen. Conversations became shorter. Familiar dynamics felt awkward. Old jokes landed wrong. Old expectations felt intrusive. Not because you became cold, but because you became honest. Honest about your energy. Honest about what you're willing to give and what you're no longer willing to tolerate. You stopped offering access by default, and that unsettled people more than any confrontation ever could, because access was where they had leverage. Your availability, your understanding, your willingness to carry emotional weight that was never yours. When you removed that, the balance shifted quietly but permanently. They began to sense it, that you were no longer waiting, no longer hoping to be chosen, no longer seeking alignment through external validation. You were choosing yourself first and letting the rest fall where it may. That kind of self-alignment creates an invisible barrier, not one built from resentment, but from clarity. People can feel it when they approach you. The way you don't lean forward anymore. The way you don't overextend. The way you don't fill silence to keep things comfortable. You're not hard to reach, you're selective. And selectivity is terrifying to people who built their identity on being needed. You also noticed something else. A strange calm when things didn't work out. When opportunities passed. When doors didn't open. Where there used to be anxiety, there was now trust. Trust in your ability to navigate uncertainty. Trust that what aligns will meet you without force. Because you already proved to yourself that you can survive without guarantees. That's the power sacrifice gave you. You don't cling, you don't chase, you don't panic. You move forward with discernment. And slowly, subtly, people began adjusting around you. Some tried to re-enter your life with new language, more respect, softer tones as if upgrading. Their approach might grant them access again. Others grew distant, not out of conflict, but because your presence reflected something they weren't ready to face. Your clarity highlighted their avoidance. Your boundaries exposed their entitlement. You didn't argue with them. You didn't correct them. You let distance do the work. Because distance is honest. It reveals who values connection and who only valued convenience. And in that space, something unexpected happened. You stopped feeling guilty. Guilty for growing. Guilty for changing. Guilty for no longer fitting into roles you'd outgrown. You realized guilt was just the residue of old conditioning. An echo from a time when you believed belonging required sacrifice of self. Now you know better. Belonging that costs your truth isn't belonging. It's containment. So you let go without ceremony, without announcements, without burning bridges. You simply stopped walking back across them. Your life began organizing itself around a new center. Not ambition, not survival alignment. You chose depth over volume, meaning over momentum, presence over performance. And the more you honored that, the more incompatible you became with your old world. Not superior, not detached, just different pace, different tolerance for noise. You noticed how little you explain now, how rarely you justify your choices, how comfortable you are letting people misunderstand you. Because clarity inside doesn't require clarity outside. That's a hard truth most people never reach. They spend their lives correcting perceptions, managing narratives, defending choices that were never wrong to begin with. You stopped doing that. You let your life speak for itself, not through spectacle, but through consistency. And while others chased visibility, you cultivated stability. While others optimized for approval, you optimized for peace. This is where your transformation becomes irreversible. Because once peace becomes your reference point, chaos loses its appeal. Drama loses its pull. Validation loses its power. You don't need to prove you're strong. You've already lived it. You don't need to announce growth. It shows in what you no longer tolerate. You don't need to convince anyone of your value. You've internalized it. And that internalization changed how you move through the world. You don't rush outcomes. You don't force connections. You don't override your intuition to meet expectations. You wait. You observe. You choose deliberately. That patience isn't passivity. It's precision. And people feel it. They feel that you're no longer available for projection, no longer responsive to pressure, no longer interested in roles that require you to shrink. Some admire it quietly, some resent it silently, some misunderstand it completely. You let all three happen, because you're no longer building a life that needs consensus. You're building a life that needs coherence. And that coherence came from sacrifice, from loss, from standing in the ashes, and choosing not to rebuild the same structure again. You didn't rise to prove them wrong. You rose because staying where you were would have meant betraying who you'd become. That's the difference. And now, as you move forward, you carry something most people never develop. An internal compass that doesn't panic in uncertainty. A self-trust that doesn't collapse under doubt. A resilience that isn't loud, but unshakable. You don't belong to your old world anymore. Not because you're above it, but because you outgrew it. And whatever comes next will require this version of you. Not the one who needed comfort, approval, or permission. The one who already survived the fire. The one who knows exactly what it costs to become real. And won't trade that truth for anything.